Good evening, everyone. It is 7 o'clock on the dots Eastern Standard Time, and this is Adam Hickey from Landmark School welcoming you to the first Landmark Learns for this academic school year. Tonight's Landmark Learns, the subject is executive function, the basics. And myself and Margot Marcou will be co-presenting. Margot will really be taking the lead in just a couple minutes on tonight's topic, but I'll act as this evening's MC and kind of introduce what's going to happen this evening. So we're happy to have everyone here. It's a quick introduction. My name is Adam Hickey. I have been at Landmark School for quite a while at this point, and I have two fabulous roles. I think they're fabulous. I love my job. Landmark School Outreach Lead Faculty, and I'll talk in just a second a little bit about what Landmark School Outreach is. And I'm also the Landmark School Research Coordinator. And in that capacity, I coordinate and establish amazing relationships with researchers in the field and in our general area to help move the field forward and the way that we help students meet their potential and just be the best people they can be. Landmark School itself has two campuses. We have our elementary middle school up in Manchester by the Sea for students in grades 2 through 8 as a day school. And our high school is just south of there in Pride's Crossing, Massachusetts. And that is for students in grades 9 through 12. And for those students, we offer both residential as well as a day program. We like to say that the best part about being at Landmark School is that we have the incredible opportunity to be both prescriptive, diagnostic and prescriptive in the approach that we take in working with students. And at the cornerstone of the work that we're doing with students on both of our campuses is a daily one-to-one tutorial that allows us to remediate the needs of students who have a specific learning disability and or dyslexia with incredible potential, who come to us to meet and achieve their academic and their social potential. Complementing Landmark School itself is Landmark School Outreach, with an incredible mission of helping educators do the work that we do on our campuses at their schools, at their districts. And Landmark School Outreach works exclusively with students. No, not with students, with educators to best help them meet the needs of their students. So we like to say we try to bring that special sauce that's happening at Landmark School to a broader, more diverse community of learners beyond our campuses themselves, which are limited in space. We service about 350 students, and we have the capacity to help so many more students through the work that Landmark School Outreach lead faculty are doing, both within the state of Massachusetts, New England, and even broader from there. So we're happy to have you here with us tonight. Before we begin with this evening's webinar, I do want to plug a couple upcoming webinars. The first one I want to speak to is one being hosted by Landmark Outreach itself. And in that webinar that will be taking place later in January on the 21st, is a really great executive function and ADHD webinar that's going to focus really about reading, the implications of executive function, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder among readers specifically with dyslexia. The presenter is Joanna Christodoulou from her lab at the Institute of Health Professions at MGH. Joanna is a wonderful researcher. She is one of our research partners who we have worked with over the years, and I can't say more about how just fabulous she is. So if you like this topic or interested in this, you really should attend that. In addition to that webinar, we have 3 more Landmark Learns webinars coming up over the course of the year. We're going to specifically look at executive function at work, executive function in the home setting, and then finally executive function at school. So as you're thinking about the work that's happening tonight, the information that Margot is going to be presenting, if you have specific questions around those three subtopics, we would encourage you to record those and save those for those future webinars. The spirit of tonight is really a primer or a broad strokes overview of executive function, really to prepare us to be able to do that deeper dive as we get ready for those questions. Having said that, I want to speak very quickly about the function. We would encourage you to use the question and answer function of the webinar, Zoom webinar platform to pose questions that do come to you during tonight's webinar, and that we will be reserving about 10 to 12 minutes at the end to address those questions. So without any further ado, I do want to move right to letting Margot introduce herself, and we'll begin tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. I'm Margot Marcou. I have been at Landmark since 2010. I started my time at Landmark on the high school campus, where I was the assistant director of the prep program there for many years and a teacher in the classroom for all the years that I was there. More recently, I've transitioned to working for Landmark Outreach as a lead faculty member like Adam, and I also work one-on-one with college students to provide executive function coaching. So I'm in the weeds with executive function a lot these days, and I'm really passionate and interested in all things executive function. And I'm happy to be here with you all tonight. Just thinking about our roadmap for the next hour, I'm going to give, Adam kind of touched upon this, excuse me, in his intro, but I am planning to give an overview of executive function. This is our kickoff to the Landmark Learn series on executive function. So my intention is really to be looking at it from a big picture lens so that we're all grounded in some common knowledge before the upcoming webinars that are really gonna, hone in and focus on strategies for at work, at home, and at school. So as a part of that, I am going to dive into some key terms, and we couldn't leave you without some takeaways and strategies. So we'll also do that, some simple things to try at home. And I've kind of layered some in throughout tonight's session as well. As I move through, Adam, I invite you to interrupt me at any point. He and I had talked about making this maybe more of a conversation if we could. So I'm just going to put that out there. Feel free to interrupt me, Adam, and I'll invite you in moments if I think of it.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Another moment before I dive in, this is the teacher in me. As I move through this webinar, I did identify 5 places where I'm hoping we can sort of pause and identify a takeaway that you could maybe record in your notes. And I do always encourage note taking. It's a great kinesthetic way to engage your mind while being, present for a webinar. I wanted to try to scaffold this a little. Again, the teacher in me. So I've included a model template here showing you how you could maybe organize your notes in a simple, effective way of taking 2-column notes, which we use at Landmark all the time. And one of our goals for 2-column notes is to really sort and organize your thinking in real time. So feel free to use this structure to capture your ideas as you go. It's always best if you can try to put things in your own words to really make sense of them as you go as well. But this is not a classroom and I won't be checking, so you also don't need to do any of that. It's just a suggestion as we go. So to get started thinking about executive function, I couldn't stop thinking about the holiday stress and how that really plays into all of this. In a meeting about this webinar leading into holiday break, one of my colleagues mentioned how stressful she was feeling about the season. When we reflected in part on how that could be because there's so many demands placed on executive function during that holiday season. And then I was at a school this week with teachers and I asked them to reflect on if they had a scenario from break they could bring forward where they had to use their executive function. And everyone had immediate great examples. So anyone who is hosting a large meal had to plan ahead of time. They had to plan out the items on the meal. They had to make grocery lists and identify a good time to go shop for those grocery items. They had to understand and plan for the timing of when dishes need to be in the oven and then out so that everything was ready and warm on time. They had to hold all of this information in their visual working memory while they had to plan seating arrangements potentially. So there's a lot that goes into just planning. And then anyone with maybe some family relationships that might have tension, they have to manage their emotions throughout the holidays and self-regulate during these events. Anyone who needed to wrap presents, you have to time that correctly so that they're wrapped, by the present opening day and you're not staying up late into the night to get that done. And then anyone who's feeling stressed by all of this has to manage that stress while still trying to enjoy the holiday season in some way. And this is without school or work or anything, right? These are just the at-home fun holiday season times. So I just thought it was such a powerful image of how executive function is part of our everyday lives, and especially right now, coming off of that season.
Well, Margot, and I think that's such a good point. This coming off the season, I've had a number of conversations, Monday and Tuesday of this week, where people are saying that they feel this sense of relief and just this feeling of, okay, the holidays were wonderful, but I'm so glad they were over. And I think that speaks to the incredible stress to the systems that are in play in order to
Mhm.
maintain all of those moving parts. And that when that kind of goes away for a bit, you are really faced with, wow, like that was a
Yeah,
lot, you know?
there's
So
a lot. Yeah.
it's such a beautiful kind of
Yeah.
way, analogy, metaphor to really set up how encompassing this is for all of us.
Mhm. Absolutely. So, what is executive function when we're talking about this? Before I dive into this, disclaimer, it's really complex. There's a lot that goes into executive function. And there's a lot of researchers in the field, and they all have slightly varying definitions. So, there's not one definition or one go to model. It's not in the DSM 5. So, I just think that's good to know because we're going to be sorting through different definitions and our own landmark definition. So as I go through these slides, keep in mind that my first takeaway is going to be a moment in your notes to try to capture your own definition of executive function, um, ideally in your own words or maybe from the slides ahead. And it's okay if you have to flex it a little because again, there's not one go-to definition. I like to start when I'm talking about executive function with visuals and analogies because I just find that a really rich way to think about things. Um, so this particular analogy comes from Thomas Brown, who's like an early researcher of executive function. And I just love his direct quote about this, so I'm going to read it. He wrote that regardless of their expertise, the musicians need a competent conductor who will select the piece to play, make sure they start playing at the same time and stay on tempo, fade in the strings and then bring in the brass, and manage them as they interpret the music. Without an effective conductor, the symphony will not produce good music. So, because of this, he calls it the musical conductor of the brain, right? We need that overarching ability to understand when we need to like bring in louder music, fade out quieter music, pick up a tempo, and all of that. And there's so many musicians and instruments that go into an orchestra that have to come together cohesively to produce beautiful sound. Um, which is also kind of what's going on when we think of executive function. There's so much that the brain has to coordinate in terms of our thoughts, our emotions, our planning in order to activate and complete a task. I also like this one because I feel like it taps into this idea of sort of a metacognitive supervisory element of our brain. And we're going to talk more about metacognition later. A different visual for this that comes from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, who has some really awesome resources about executive function, excuse me, is the air traffic controller of the brain. I also really like this one. It's a little more visual maybe and less musical and auditory. But if you think about being in an airport and how essential that air traffic controller system is to the functionality of planes landing and taking off safely and smoothly, it is absolutely essential for that. And, you know, I often think about that experience. Maybe you've also had it when you're on a plane and you're just eager to get to your destination or to get home, but the pilot comes on and says, they're not ready for us on the runway, so we're going to have to circle the air a little bit. And everyone kind of groans. But thank goodness that exists because otherwise it would not be safe to land and the pilot wouldn't know that. So it's an essential system to coordinate all of that. It goes into the effective, smooth running of an airport, much like when we need to execute our own tasks. And then the last visuals I'm going to leave you with both come from Lynn Meltzer, who also has a ton of great executive function research out there. She's local in Lexington. Um, so she has two things I like to talk about. One is the Rubik's Cube of the brain, and the other is this concept of the forest versus the trees. So the Rubik's Cube of the brain is kind of a way to push back against this idea of like one little mini me sitting in your brain coordinating all the events and actually show that, well, it's everything is interrelated, right? When you shift any of these Rubik's Cube colors, everything else is going to be shifting and working together. It's all integrated. So, thinking about flexibility, organization, goal setting, prioritization, like those all impact each other when we think about how we fluidly use our executive functions. And then she also talks about this concept of the forest from the trees, which is really thinking about cognitive flexibility and shifting. So if you think about when you're standing at the top of the mountain, you look out and you can see valleys and other mountains in the distance and all of the forest laid out before you. But if you're at the bottom of that mountain, you're really only going to be seeing the one tree in front of you and the leaves on that tree and the bark on that tree. And it's hard maybe to shift between knowing that big picture and all of the forest and the details of each of the trees that make up that forest. So that's, I think, a great visual for the other aspect of executive function that's so key, which is this concept of cognitive flexibility and of flexibly shifting, which I'll talk a little bit more about later too. So those are my visuals. Like I said, when we think of the definition itself, there is no one definition and it's not a diagnosis in the DSM-5. But at Landmark, our working definition, which comes from Patricia Newhall, is that I'm going to call it EF, by the way, moving forward, I think. EF is the brain's ability to coordinate the cognitive and psychological processes needed to initiate, sustain, monitor, and adapt the behaviors and attitudes required to achieve a goal. Like many of the definitions, it's a bit of a mouthful. So let's break it down a little bit. I like to really highlight some of the key words in this definition that I think help us make sense of what executive function is really all about. So this idea of coordinate, it's all about coordination, these systems working together and having to come together in order to execute and produce whatever our goal might be. And that's especially true, that coordination, when anything is novel or multi-step or particularly challenging for us. I also like to draw attention to this concept of both cognitive and psychological processes. When we're talking about executive function, we're really talking about both thinking, learning, and importantly, emotion and how they work together. And we're going to talk about that throughout this as well. I will say I was super lucky this year I got to go to the Learning in the Brain conference on emotions and emotional regulation. And my key takeaway from that was that learning is emotional. You cannot separate them. Emotions are part of learning. So that feeds right into this concept of executive function as well and how it's a part of that system. And then when you dive into like, okay, what are all these, emotional, psychological, cognitive things that are coordinating to do? Well, it's about how do we initiate a task? How do we get started on that task? How do we sustain throughout? So that's sustaining our attention, our motivation, our effort throughout the duration of whatever task we're trying to complete. How do we monitor ourselves throughout that, bring self-awareness to the process and monitor our actions, and then adapt? How are we flexible as we are needed, which we'll need to be as we move through anything, so that we can adapt and shift our behavior, how we act, we actually respond to our environment and our attitude, our beliefs, our internal emotions, that's where they come in again, all to achieve a goal. Now, goals can be something really large, like a college thesis or a big school project, but they can also be daily, regular things we're trying to do, like get out of the house on time to avoid being tardy to school. That is a goal. So how do we initiate that task, sustain, and do all that goes into it to successfully achieve that goal? So there's a lot already right there that's going into what it means when we talk about executive function. I also like this definition, so I thought I would bring it in because it's a little bit simpler and it's a nice complement to our landmark definition. This comes from Sabine Doble, who has a great TED Talk that I recommend a lot. It's called How Your Brain's Executive Function Works and How to Improve It. So she has a slightly simpler definition, like I said, and she says that it's our amazing ability to consciously control our thoughts, emotions, and actions in order to achieve goals. And one thing I really love that she highlighted is she compares this to driving, like when we are first learning to drive. But I'm actually going to add to that. I think it's helpful to think about all the executive functions we have to use when we're learning to drive, but also in two other situations. And those are when we're in a really stressful driving situation, like maybe following directions in city, like a downtown city traffic, or in a totally new situation, like maybe we're driving in a country where you have to drive on the opposite side of the road. So in all of those situations, when it's brand new or when it's really stressful, excuse me, or when it's like extra challenging and it changes up how what we normally have done, our EF is taxed even more. And we notice that we're using our executive function because we have to really consciously pay attention to all that's going on. We have to pay attention to the traffic rules in different ways. We have to hold the directions in our working memory while we navigate the roads that may be really congested and full of angry drivers who are honking at us. And that's causing us stress. So we have to manage that stress while we're trying to effectively drive safely and get where we're trying to go. So I think that's a great moment if you're ever like, what is executive function? If you find yourself driving in one of those situations and you notice that you're like gripping the steering wheel a little more tightly and you're feeling exhausted because you have to think so hard, that's because you're actively using your executive function in a way that you might not always have to do when you're moving through regular tasks of the day. So that and the holiday planning stress, I think, are two great ways to think about like when is this being used regularly? Okay, so I'm going to pause here. It's our first takeaway. If you are taking notes, now's a great time to maybe jot them down. Maybe you've been doing that while I was talking, which is great too. I think our big idea to get is that we use executive function all the time, but in general, when we are envisioning a goal, trying to lay out a path toward that goal, sustain our attention, effort, and motivation throughout the work towards that goal, managing our emotions as they come up inevitably along the way, resisting any distractions, using flexibility to adapt, and we're trying to stay motivated through all of that to successfully execute our plan. So there's a lot going on.
Margot, I really like that you brought in these multiple definitions and the idea of looking at it from slightly different perspectives. And I like it for a couple of reasons. One is that when we're working with students, they're so want just one answer. And I think it's very freeing for them to understand that complexity requires looking at things in slightly different ways, because each of those definitions, I think, helps us understand it when we think about struggles in managing our own executive function
Mhm.
based upon the complexity of the task. And what one definition might be really resonate with one student or person, whereas another has a different effect for another student. So thank you for like giving us the perspective from different angles. I think it's really helpful.
You're welcome. I would also say, just adding to that, one thing that Sabine Doble also talks about is how context matters. And so I think that's just a different way to talk about, that concept of when you're driving in a different place. But your executive function will look different depending on the context of the task itself, the environment that you're in, the setting, the situation. So all of that's really important to note as well. So I dive into some sort of the development of executive function and some of the key terms. I call this my brain slide. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not going to dive in or linger too long on this, don't worry. But just very simply, I think it's helpful to note that through functional MRIs, they have been able to identify that there are, our executive function circuits are taking place in the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes of our brain. And that's important to note because this part of the brain doesn't really fully develop until our mid 20s. So that, meaning even those who might not have executive function like vulnerabilities or deficits, they're still developing their whole executive function system into adulthood. So when I'm talking to educators out in the world about this, I think that's so important because to me it highlights the fact that we need to be supporting executive function for all of our learners across grade levels to scaffold and support the development of these systems in their brain. Um, and then I think it's also helpful to know just for our own understanding and comfort to know like this is an evolving part of who we are as learners and of our brains in general. I think it's also, excuse me, worth noting that you definitely can implement strategies to support executive function, and routines lead to improvement, practice leads to improvement over time. But I think that over time is key. There's no quick fix to executive function where it's like, here, do this one thing, and now you've done it once. And so executive function is solved. It's not quite like that. It's a long process where routines and practice over time are really helpful. Going back to the Harvard Center on Developing Child, they had a great quote about this. They note that as children develop these capacities, they need practice, reflecting on their experiences, talking about what they are doing and why, monitoring their actions, considering possible next steps, and evaluating the effectiveness of their decisions. So these are all things that children can practice as they're talking about, but adolescents and adults can practice those things as well. The simple helpful moment of inserting a pause and asking ourselves or others to reflect on their experiences, their decisions, the actions, the next steps they're planning to take. That moment to pause and reflect can be a really powerful and helpful tool, and it builds that metacognitive skill, which again we'll talk about in a bit. That is a goal for many of our learners.
I
Adam, I think you
really,
had a great story here too
yeah, and
to
I just
support
wanted
that.
to emphasize that final bullet point on this slide around the idea that there's no really quick fix. In addition to the work that I do at Landmark School, I'm also working privately with some clients. And I often will be called by families who are in crisis because their child is really struggling with inattentiveness, complemented by incredible vulnerabilities around executive function. And they just want the quick fix. Just come in, work with my child, tell us what to do. And it's a longer moment that needs more than a moment. It's a long, it's a journey that you need to take. But this particular student I've been with for a year, and I was with him earlier this afternoon. And Margot, a year ago, we're looking at the Google Classroom list of owed work that was 20 assignments long. And then the Aspen, the other piece of the school data management system that also suggested even more assignments that hadn't been turned in. And now 12 months later, almost to the day, we're checking in on both of those platforms. And consistently since September, there is no missing work. And it develops slowly over time. And so you got to get your student or your client or your person to understand it takes some work, but it is absolutely achievable. And the
Yeah.
other piece that I just would want to say relative to this slide is that, yes, that prefrontal lobe is not maturing until the mid-20s, but we don't have the luxury of just waiting for it to
Mm.
mature because we're asking students to do incredibly complex tasks. And so if we want them to be able to do that, we have to also build in time for the support and the development of those skills that open up accessibility to the complexity of those tasks in a way that makes the student feel good about their achievements.
I love that. And how can we build in routines to do just that throughout our day, at
Right,
school, at home, so that we can accomplish that? I think that's
right.
great to think about. Yeah. So sticking with Harvard Center and Developing Child, as we dive in and dig into executive function a little bit more in terms of like the terms that are used regularly when talking about EF, Um, while researchers have very different ways of representing it, and they have sometimes different models, different domains, these days, more recent researchers out there tend to agree on these three central skill areas. I've been calling them the big three, of working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. So I'm going to dive into each one of these over the next few slides. So working memory, first one, we could talk about, and I've heard Adam talk about working memory and memory for an hour or longer. So there's a lot you could say about working memory. Um, in its simplest terms, it's the skill of holding and manipulating information in your mind, holding and using information. Research shows that children with a learning disability can typically only hold about 3 ± 2 items in their minds. So keep in mind that could be as little as one thing at a time that a child could potentially hold in their working memory. Um, so that's really worth noting because we need our working memory all the time. If you're thinking about a student in school, they're using working memory constantly. They have to use it while holding a teacher's question in their mind to formulate their answer, or when they're following multi-step directions at school or at home, because they tend to get a lot of directions in both places. Or when reading, you need to use your working memory to hold on to meaning at the word level, to hold on to sounds throughout that word, at the paragraph level to hold on meaning from the beginning to the end of it, and at the page or longer passage level. So working memory is huge. This is one of the reasons that routines around note taking and directions are so important when we think about at school, things that teachers can do to help reduce the cognitive load. Um, in general, it's really helpful when it comes to working memory. And I think I'm gonna live a little bit in that idea of giving oral directions and how huge that can be. So I'm gonna get some specifics about that later. But when I'm talking about that, keep in mind the working memory piece as I go. The next piece of the big three, or the next area in the big three, is inhibitory control. And that's really how we are able to control our thoughts and our impulses to resist temptations or distractions. An example that I like to give is when a student is trying to listen to the teacher, but a buddy is also whispering to them, they have to resist the temptation to listen to that friend and instead listen to the boring teacher. And I'll take the role of boring teacher gladly. I don't mean that offensively. Um, but that's hard. You have to inhibit this desire to really want to be able to engaging with your friend, which is giving you maybe more in that moment than having to engage in a school related task. In a lab setting, this is often tested through delayed gratification tests, like the marshmallow test, for example, is a famous one. If you're unfamiliar, I'm going to quickly go over it because I'm going to talk about it again later. I think this test has become fascinating in how people use it these days. Um, the basic concept is children are given one marshmallow and told they can eat that one marshmallow now, or they can wait and eat two marshmallows later. And children typically struggle to resist that temptation and eat the marshmallow now. They're struggling in that moment with response inhibition. They have to inhibit that desire to eat because they want to eat it. So they're going to eat it now instead of inhibiting it so they can wait and actually get more. I'm going to talk about this more later when we dig into emotions, but it is a helpful way to just think about inhibitory control as a starting point. And then the last one is cognitive flexibility, which again, I've talked about a bit, that ability to shift gears, adjust our strategies or our thinking as we are moving through a task. You need this in a lot of different ways that I think can be sneaky. So you also need it like if you're shifting flexibly between rules, say in a game or in a lab test. You have to switch gears after recess when you're transitioning back into math class. Um, you have to shift gears in terms of, say, they talk about this with empathy, to shift gears between perspectives when you're reading or when you're trying to take on the perspective of another. Um, and you have to try out different strategies if they're not working. Like if you're doing a task and it's not working, you have to shift to a different strategy. I had one example came to mind for me recently. I was working with one of the college students I work with, and it was finals time, so she had to study. And she had a clear strategy for how she liked to study. She liked to use Quizlet, where she would sort of just write definitions, term definition. Um, but, we found that in this college setting, just knowing the definitions wasn't really enough. She needed to provide examples of those definitions. She needed to use the term in context. She had to make connections between all the different terms. So Quizlet, in the way she was using it, wasn't really working as her strategy. So she had to shift gears. But she found that really difficult to do without some scaffolded support from me to be able to say, like, what are some different strategies you can? I hear that this has been a really good one for you in the past, but it's not quite working anymore given the complexity of this task. So, how can we shift your strategy even a little to try to make it work more effectively? And that was all about, in part, her cognitive flexibility when it came to that particular task. Okay, another moment to pause. I think big ideas to get here for me that I might summarize and you can think about as you write your own note would be, as a reminder that there is no official diagnosis. Our executive functions are developing into our 20s, and there are different models and definitions that exist for it, but all tend to agree on these three really big main components of executive function of working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. So after you've had a minute, I'm just going to pause with a little bit of silence and then move on. Okay. I have a few more terms because I just can't help it. Those big three are really helpful when it comes to understanding executive function, don't get me wrong. But there are so many other terms that I use all the time when I'm talking about executive function that I know parents and teachers and students tend to hear more often than maybe some of the more clinical, more like researchy terms. So I have 2 slides. I'm going to talk about 8 different terms that I just think are helpful, and I'm going to try to use them to also throw in some strategies and examples. So these particular ones are coming from Dawson and Guare, who wrote Smart but Scattered, as well as this textbook here, Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents. They have some great strategies overall for supporting executive function. So the first terms on this slide are probably ones you're really familiar with, like time management, planning, organization. Like we've heard these, right? We talk about them a lot. We know that our students can really struggle to manage their time, meet deadlines, make and follow a plan of any sort, follow any sort of organized approach to materials, either physical or digital, and they can struggle to sustain their attention when necessary to do all of those things and to sustain throughout a task. So I know that these are familiar terms, but I also think these are good examples and reminders of why, we can try simple things at home that can really help with any of these. So when I think about time management, I'm often thinking about, like, how can I make time visible in the home space? Can I use clocks regularly and calendars and make sure that I'm referencing them and looking at the calendar with my child, having them interact with it in some way and remind me of what's coming up in the week ahead? Can I have them create a plan of attack for their homework and verbalize that plan to me so that they can kind of flex that planning muscle a little bit on a nightly basis while they're sitting down just to do their homework? Can I have clear systems of organization in the home, like a consistent place where the backpack goes every night so it's easy to find in the morning and reduces stress during that morning transitional time of getting out of the house? So I think there are different things we can try to do. But I think coming back to that point about practice over time, when it comes to these things seem simple, and yet they're actually pretty complex for many students who might have vulnerabilities in their executive function. And so it takes a lot of practice and a lot of really solid routines in place to internalize, for our students to internalize some of these skills. I think back to kind of like Adam, a college student I've been working with now for a year and a half. And just talking about, let's live in that planning place for now. At first, we set up a system for her to track her due dates and her assignments, and then make a plan from those of how she's going to attack them over the week. So at first, a year and a half ago, we were, every time we met, going through all of her class syllabi and all of her online class platforms to find those dates and populate them, make sure they were still current and up to date, and together make a plan of attack. But now, and we did that consistently, routinely all year. By this year, this past semester, when we would get on the call, she had already added all of the dates and had made her first go at a plan. And so now we were just talking through, okay, tell me about your plan. Why did you choose to break it down this way? Do you see any roadblocks that might come up? Do you have anything going on that could shift your plan and make you have to think about it differently? So she definitely over time had internalized a lot of these planning skills, but it did take time, routine, and support and scaffolding for me in a consistent way. So I just think that's another helpful way of thinking about how valuable that support can be and how it does take that time.
It really does take the time. And
Yeah.
I don't think we can emphasize that enough. But I also want to speak to what I think is the real power of the previous slides that you just presented. And what I'm thinking about and reflecting on tonight as you speak is the idea that executive function, by definition, is an abstract noun. And abstract nouns are challenging for us to understand because you can't hold them. You can't pick up executive function and put it on the table or put it on a shelf. And
Mm,
so when you presented on the three variables of working memory, cognitive flexibility, etc., what students find so powerful about that is it begins to give them the language to help understand and describe what it is that they're experiencing and feeling.
mhm,
And that's what's so important. So, yes, tonight is really a broad sweep around definitions, but I just don't want to miss the power of what you're presenting is also the starting point for the conversation to provide the control that a student is is really looking for to move forward.
mm,
And I'm thinking about the four bullet points on this slide you're showing right now, and how
mhm.
those bullet points could categorically sit underneath the previous slide as well. And so,
Absolutely. They evolve, they are a
yeah,
part of, and they are taxed by those other systems of working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control. They all kind of interrelate. That's that Rubik's Cube idea, right? They
yeah.
all work together.
Yeah. So if you're listening tonight, watching Margot and me tonight, and you're like, wow, you guys are maybe you're experiencing this as very new information or it's moving really fast, I would encourage you to go back and rewatch this. It'll be archived and available for free, and kind of go through it again with a second viewing and a slightly different perspective.
Okay. Oop, my thing just went. Okay. I have another slide of tasks. I mean, of terms. It's my last one before I switch gears, and I won't linger on it too long because have my eye on the clock all of a sudden. I just wanted to say, so those are all common terms we talk about a lot when it comes to executive function, but these are also terms that I use all the time and are super also prevalent within the executive function system. So that's that ability of task initiation. Just initiating a task can be really challenging, especially when it is one that is larger, overwhelming, or multi-step. So the college students I work with, we're talking a lot about activation because it's about how do we help break tasks down for our children and our students. Excuse me. I had recently heard a cool analogy from someone named Lars Doucet who talked about learning to ride a bike without pedals, and that children tend to fear that moment when they're learning to ride a bike and their parents holding them and pushing them and then they let go, and that's really scary. But I guess there's this method out there where you can remove the pedals first, and children just first have to learn balance and stability without the added fear of speed. And then you can add the pedals back on so that they can start to control, focus on controlling speed after they've already managed balance. Um, and I just thought that was a really cool analogy for thinking through how do I take the pedals off? Or how do I break this task down? Like, how do I get to the simpler, more discrete tasks? That is a skill that we really want to help our young people develop, because it helps with task management when you're an adult so much if you can break down and have those discrete steps. And it feeds right into the next three on this slide as well. Goal directed persistence. How do you have a goal in mind, be able to visualize it, and create a path toward it? But what I like about this term is that it includes that term persistence, which is this whole idea of like, how do you persevere when you inevitably encounter roadblocks along the way, which is huge. And then self-monitoring and metacognition are really part of what I wanted to just pause and think about in terms of how do we bring awareness to our own behavior throughout. Metacognition is all about that overarching ability to think about our thinking. When we're being really metacognitive, it means we understand our own needs, we understand the demands of a task at hand, and we can make like self-aware choices based on what's going to be needed to complete that task. And that's our ultimate goal for all of our learners. And that's why I've really been focusing a lot lately on the need to build in that time for self-reflection in all of my work with the college students I work with. And I'm encouraging teachers to do the same in the classroom, just to build in a moment to have self-reflection for all their successes as well as the failures. I think often we only prompt it when it hasn't gone great, but it's also great to reflect after something went really well so that you can help your student or child bring to the front of their mind, like, here's what I did to have that success. And that can be replicable, right? I can do that again, but I don't want to just like glaze over it and just assume it was, oh, this task just went by easily for some reason. No, you want to hone in on why. What'd you feel good about? What could have gone better? And let's just talk about that and think about it for next time. So my key takeaway here after those slides is just that I think helping us understand that everything from really commonly discussed skills like time management to higher order thinking skills like metacognition can be a function of our executive skills. And they can all be areas of potential strength or challenge, and it can look different depending on the context and the person. That's a lot to go into. Adam, I know we need some question time at the end, so I do want to address the emotional slides, and then we can dive in.
Yeah,
Great.
do that.
Okay. Hot and cool executive function are some terms that are being thrown out there, and this researcher, Mewison and Zalazzo, have really talked a lot about that. Just in the simple terms, cool is less emotional and hot is more emotional when these terms are being used. So cool EF refers to aspects that are traditionally measured in like a less stressful, emotionally cool lab environment. So such as recalling a sequence of numbers or sorting objects based on color or shape. I'll get more into specifics in the following slide, but just to give you this big picture. And then hot, in contrast to that, is measured outside of the laboratory in motivationally and emotionally significant situations they call, quote, in the wild, which I really like. That just means at school and at home, right? Like out in the world, when things have an emotional charge to them. So I think this can help explain why children may perform really well on a cool EF task, maybe when they're being tested, but then, like in a lab when they're getting tested, but then it can be confusing when they really struggle in context in an emotionally charged environment. So let's dive into that a little bit. So if we're thinking about cool executive function skills, I'm not going to go too long into the dimensional card sort, but it's just a really simple test where children have to sort cards first based on color, and then they have to shift and sort the same cards, but now by shape. So this is going to test their cognitive flexibility, their working memory, but there's no real emotional weight to it. There's no stakes if they don't do well. They're not in a classroom setting with peers or a teacher who might have some sort of relationship with them that's charged. It's just kind of a lab setting test. So there's no emotion to it, and therefore it's tested in a different way. If you also think about the marshmallow test, I'm going to talk about it revisited. So the way I had talked about it in the first, earlier on, that is its kind of classic stance, and that's when it's hot. When the marshmallow test is like really truly just by itself, it's a hot task because the student has to inhibit an emotional desire to eat the marshmallow. But they revisited it, excuse me, and turned it into a cool task, which I thought was really fascinating. So children were given the same set of rules, but asked to make the decision for someone else. So I'm given the marshmallow, or I'm told, Adam over there, he has one marshmallow. He can choose to eat it now, or he can wait and he'll get two marshmallows later. And when it's about someone else, the children are more likely to say, oh, well, he should wait and then he can eat two marshmallows. They're like, great. Okay, now here's one marshmallow for you. You can choose to eat it now or wait and get two later. And the children will eat the marshmallow right in front of them and they still can't wait. And so that to me is a perfect example of how something can go from cool to hot. It's cool because it's over there and I'm detached. But when I'm emotionally impacted and I am the one who's eating the marshmallows, it's hard for me to make that decision that on the face value might seem kind of logical. It shows the power emotions can have on our decision making. I think another way to think about this is how hot executive function can like sneakily exist in a task. For example, when giving multiple step oral directions, which we often do at home without realizing it. So if we're thinking of an example with young children, if we say, pick up the toys in your room, in the hallway, and in the living room before you can go outside and play. It feels like a really simple set of directions. But when you view it through this hot and cool lens, if you think about the cool demands, they have to remember those three locations, hold the directions and the locations in their working memory, and monitor their progress as they go. And then if you shift to thinking of it from the hot demands, the emotionally charged demands, if you will, they have to inhibit that desire to play with the toys around them instead of putting them away. They have to also resist the desire to go outside and play right now and right this minute instead of after they've put those toys away. So all of that can make it really hard to then focus on the task at hand. So it becomes a hot task rather than just this cool task of, oh, it's just about working memory. No, it's about, which is already could be taxing for our students if they can only hold one potential item in their memory. And then you add to that the desire to do all these other things instead, like play with the toys or go outside. So suddenly you can see why it might be really hard for a child to focus on that task. And I think this is exactly what can come into play when it comes to high stress assignments or situations. So when you're thinking of watching your child at home with a school project, or you're trying to plan a big family meal, like that's when this comes in and it becomes a hot task. So I like to think about this in terms of like the bottom line, which is that emotion plays a role in our learning and in how we are able to move through, you know, executing on these tasks. Um, I think it's another plug for why it's so helpful to reduce the demands and scaffold development of these skills, give one direction at a time or remove the desirable distractions to help students kind of break that task down and feel successful. So our big idea for this is that emotions cannot be divorced from these systems. It's integral to learning, it's integral to executive function, and it's a part of how we are able to effectively use our executive functions is that kind of emotional regulation. So it's also just helpful to know when things are charged for your child too, because it can explain when they might be struggling to initiate or execute.
I really like your use of the word sneaky a couple minutes ago, because
Yeah,
it's that you never intended to be emotionally charged or really didn't even think there were emotions involved in can be perceived by the receiver as fairly emotionally,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
loaded. And that's so that use of the word sneaky really resonates. I think that's important.
And I think it's also, I was just going to end on this, which is that executive function is complex. Part of it's because it's sneaky, right? There are things we don't notice. It shifts based on the context, based on the emotions, based on so much. And there's a lot that's already going on and being coordinated when we think about the effective use of executive function to begin with.
Cool.
So some really simple takeaways. Adam and I had sort of brainstormed like, what are some things you could try at home I think it can be really helpful to be intentional when giving directions at home, like that example about picking up toys. Um, and some quick things to implement when giving those directions would be to ask that child to reverbalize, have them have to say back to you what the directions were. This is a great way to capture their understanding, make sure they are understanding it, and um, kind of pause in the moment so that they're not just racing off. Um, Trying to provide visual as best you can for what a clean room looks like and visuals for, your routine for the start of the day. Break down those directions into really discrete steps as often as you can, and then try to remove distractions. So if it's whether that's the phone, I hate to say it, removing the phone during homework time, or if you're really, that toy example, pick up one room at a time for toys. So they don't have the distraction of all the toys, they just have the toys in each room before you then say, okay, go play. And the other piece that I just really keep talking about is that prompting for self reflection, really trying to build the metacognition of our children by asking them to reflect on things in all the different ways that could be, whether it's what they learned, how their day was, if something didn't go well, just talk about it. And then let that be, a building block for next time. There are going to be some references here, but I wanted to pause for a minute. We have probably time for one, maybe two questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So, and before we get to them, just really quickly, you touched upon the idea of metacognition, and the marshmallow test, and both of those reminded me of the power of self-talk. I remember in the first
Hmm.
marshmallow test, they were very keen to pay attention to those children who were able to resist the temptation were the ones that demonstrated a higher level of self-talk to
Absolutely. Yeah.
work their way through it. And we know that self-talk also is a bridge to our ability to be metacognitive. That statement that I just made does bring us to the first question, though,
Mm.
which is, and I'll read the question, how can we support a student in maintaining a level of self-esteem and motivation to continue their efforts in the face of grades and successes that don't really reflect how hard they're working?
Um, I'm processing that question because I feel like it was long. How do we help
Yeah.
them stay
Yeah, I think
motivated
that the real
when,
gist of the question is like, in the spirit of this is a long journey,
yeah.
after a couple of weeks of working with the student, we know how hard they're working. How do
Mm.
we just keep them invested when they're not getting the immediate gratification of, wow, I worked really hard on that and I got an A
Okay.
on the science test. Well, no, I didn't get an A, but I got a C, which is way better than maybe
Yeah.
the grade I got the time before. Any ideas on how we build in
Yeah.
moments of keeping the motivation going in the face of
For
not that immediate gratification?
yeah. First of all, thank you for breaking that question down for me as I was listening.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think a lot of it is it's all about pausing and reflecting on, well, what progress have we made? Like celebrating the victories as they come, no matter how small they are, to help a student feel really great about the process. I think a lot of it, that's something I used to talk about and do talk about when I'm in schools, is really trying to shift from so much focus on the product and instead focus on the process. Like, how much progress have you made just in your ability to follow through with this plan or to break this task down? It's okay if you got a C on it, but were you following a plan where a little bit more effectively than last time? Yeah, that's great. That I hope that you're feeling good about that because I noticed how well you followed that plan this time, and that should be celebrated. So I think a lot of it is those really celebrating those small moments along the way.
And then one more question, Margot. I totally agree with everything you just said. I think it was great. Is we had a woman email us earlier today who clearly has incredible executive function skills herself, which I really appreciate. Looking for some answers around like how do we help support really basic arguably some basic stuff like checking emails or making
Mhm.
sure personal finances are in shape. For
Mhm.
those in the weed stuff, any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that question really highlights how frustrating it can feel, maybe to have vulnerabilities with executive function when there are all these life tasks that need it. Um, and I don't have one system or trick that I'm gonna subscribe for things like that. But I do think it can be really helpful just to think about it in terms of those routines. How can you create a routine or habit out of it? Whether that's a clear routine where you check your email at a certain time every day. Like we do that at work a lot. We get to the office and we check our email first thing. How do we introduce that into other people's lives? Or also like keeping it in sight and present. I know, Adam, you and I had talked about that. Like if it's out of sight, it can be out of mind. So making
Right.
sure that things are visible to you, that are tied to time, and that you're making it into a routine as often as you can.
Yeah.
But just
Yeah.
be some big picture things to think about. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Margot, thank you so much for your efforts tonight. I really appreciate it. I
Thank you.
enjoyed spending the last hour listening to you speak about a topic that clearly you have a passion about. Um, Thank you, everyone, for joining us for tonight's webinar. And one more time before we leave, I just wanted to remind everyone that we have three more coming. So we have one on February 5th, executive function at work. We'll have one on March 26th, executive function at home. And our last one for the year will be executive function at school. Again, thank you everyone for joining. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.